I can still remember the time. It must be like 2004 maybe. Stood working in the kitchen at McDonald's, and one of the managers came in and he said, "We've got a new product coming out." I went on a training day yesterday, and from that moment my life changed, because what he announced to us was that McDonald's were bringing in the Big Tasty. Right, 1/3 of a pound of burger, gorgeous sauce, cheese. Oh, and do you remember the advert for that? The Big Tasty? The Big Tasty. Enough said. Right? Because it's everything, in that description, everything food should be, right? It's big and it's tasty. That's what food should be. Food as it's meant to be, big and tasty. What else do you need? And what Jesus was telling us last week, do you remember, is that life's like that. Life as it should be, life as it's meant to be, verses 1 to 12, these blessings of life as it meant to be, it's the big life. It's life to the full. Jesus says in John's Gospel, John and I read it this week, that he came to bring life and to give it to the full. This dependent, fruitful, blessed life. The big life. But also, he says in verse 13 to 16, life, the big life, the dependent, the fruitful life, should be tasty. It should be a life lived demonstrating that wonderful, dependent, fruitful life to the world around us. Our lives should give a taste of what life as it's meant to be is like. Our lives, he said, should reflect the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, so that others might see that light, might know Jesus. And so Jesus says, if we're living life as it's meant to be, life to the full, this blessed life, we're going to taste and we're going to shine the light of the glory of God. But what does that actually mean? Two things this morning that Jesus tells us to be here if we're following him. First thing, he says, be tasty. Now, we discovered, didn't we, most of us, just recently, that although most of us have never seen Blade Runner, Kevin has never seen Forrest Gump. But even he knows the ultimate quote from Forrest Gump, right? Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get next. It's a great saying, right? And it's really helpful because in the second half of that sentence, he defines what the metaphor, he defines what the picture says. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get next. But often when we use pictures and metaphors like that, the problem is we don't define, we don't limit what the metaphor means. Because it could have been, right? Life is like a box of chocolates. It makes you fat, addicted to sugar, diabetic, and there's always a few bounties in there that nobody wants to eat. Right? That metaphor could have meant that. We could have thought of everything that was true about a box of chocolates and said that's what Forrest Gump was telling us. But he wasn't. He was just using this metaphor to say, you never know what you're going to get next. Life's unpredictable. You can't predict the future. And I think we especially do that with these two pictures Jesus uses here in verses 13 to 16. I've read a few books this week, and the number of times you read verse 13, Jesus says you're the salt of the earth, and then they tell me everything that's true about salt ever, and apply that to what Jesus meant here. It's a preservative. It's was used in this covenant. It kills stuff. You know, right, if you plough the stuff into salt into the soil, it kills everything, right? And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And it can be true of light as well. But I think Jesus is using this metaphor. I think the context demands that we read this metaphor, this picture, in a certain way. So let's look at it. Look at verse 13, please. You, Jesus says to the disciples, do you remember verses 1 and 2? So specifically to his disciples, the crowd might be watching on, but specifically to his disciples, he says, you are the salt of the earth. And he says in verse 14, you are the light of the world. The way the word is, apparently, is emphatic. It's not, you might be, or you can be, you are. It is something you are. The disciples are salt and light. It's a fact. Not necessarily even a promise. It's a fact. We are, if we're Jesus' disciples, following him in the church, salt and light for the world around us. So Jesus is saying we need to live as such. He's saying if you're a disciple of Jesus, you don't get a choice. Being salt and light to the world is not something for super Christians. It's not optional. It's what we do if we're a disciple of Jesus. So it's quite important we know what it means, right? Well, let's look at this first one. Salt, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled. Oh, the metaphors go all over the place here. You know, sodium carbonate or whatever it is. I know that's wrong, but I can't remember what it is. Thank you, whatever. Can't lose its saltiness, so therefore it's wrong. Don't get too far into the metaphor. Let's look at it. Salt in the Bible is generally used in kind of two ways. Like if you put into Bible Gateway, salt in the Bible, it comes up in two ways. One, it's ploughing salt into the ground so that crops don't grow, like William Conqueror did all around here in the 11th century. And the other way it's used is with food, generally in terms of sacrifices. Sacrifices that are then going to be cooked. So you can go to Leviticus 2:13, and the Lord says, put salt onto the burnt offering so that it might be a sweet-smelling aroma. It's to do with taste. And I think the context helps us with that, because look, verses 10 to 12, before verse 13, Jesus tells the disciples they're going to leave a bad taste in the mouth of people in the world. Right? They're going to insult them. They're going to persecute them. They're going to falsely say all kinds of things against them because they taste of Jesus. Verse 16, Jesus says they're living in a way that others might see God's glory. They're going to leave the taste of Jesus in the mouth of people. Now, we don't really get that that's the main function of salt. You know, we think about people back in the day, they used it to preserve stuff, right? They rubbed it in during the winter, into meat. But the other thing is that this time, people didn't really eat meat that often. But what we don't get is that without salt, food doesn't really taste right nice. You go home and you check the packets on all your food in your house, every single one of them pretty much has got salt in them. And around the world where it's not like that, they put salt on stuff. So we had a friend from Romania. She made you some toast and put butter all over it. And then she'd sprinkle salt all over it. Because she was just used to the butter there not having salt in it. Our butter's got salt in it. It brings out the taste. It allows you to taste it. And then Jesus says, verse 14, you are light. Well, that's an outrageous statement, isn't it? We are the light of the world. We are Jesus. I thought you said in John's Gospel, I am the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world, Jesus says it in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 12. But Jesus is calling them here to reflect that light. You know, like in a submarine, they put the periscope up. It's dark in a submarine, right? It's underwater. It's all enclosed. You put the periscope up and the mirror's shining down and the light from outside comes down and shines into the darkness. Jesus says we're to be mirrors reflecting his glory, who he is to the world around us. What's Jesus telling us here, verses 13 to 16, about what we need to be? Look, if we're in Jesus, if we're walking together in Jesus, if we're living that dependent, fruitful life that he gives us, that we looked at last week, our lives should taste of Jesus. They should adorn the gospel. They should reflect the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Our lives and our speech and our action and our attitudes should taste of Jesus' goodness, so that others, as Psalm 34 says, might taste and see that the Lord is good. That's what he says, verse 16. Jesus says, if we're living dependent, fruitful lives, we're going to be living lives which can only be explained by the gospel. Confident in his grace. Risky lives because where we take risks for the gospel, even to be persecuted. Lives that are gospel and Jesus saturated and obsessed. Lives that are lived loving and committed to and prioritizing the Lord's people. Lives focused on speaking the truth of the gospel. Lives ultimately that carry the taste of Jesus out into the world. Lives that, like salt, bring out the flavour. They show what life is meant to be like. This blessed life, dependent and fruitful. Lives that scream our people in word and deed, come, taste and see that the Lord is good. So let's ask a question. Just how tasty is your life? You know, not tasty in a Nessa from Gavin and Stacey way. You know, not tasty, but, well, tasty like fish and chips. I could right eat fish and chips at the minute. You know, nice good fish and chips at the seaside. Does your life taste like that in a spiritual sense to people? I'd like a bit of that. Is that what they think? Or are we just the same? You know, how do we see that? What dreams are you living for? If you asked your non-Christian friends around you, they say, what dreams is this person living for? What motivates them? What gets them out of bed in the morning? Are our answers going to be any different to those around us? What comfort do we turn to when life goes bad? What do we moan about all the time? Maybe even if we don't realise it, what makes us despair because we don't have it? What do we treasure in life? What taste do you and I and we together leave in the mouths of the people we spend time with? And more important than whether we taste good or bad is, do we taste of Jesus? Because ultimately, I think this salt here that Jesus is talking about tastes like fruit. That sounds an odd thing, doesn't it? And you probably don't put salt on your fruit. That won't bring out the taste. But it looks like, it tastes like this dependent life, this fruitful life of verses 7 to 12. The merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who... people who hate Jesus persecute, because it tastes so much of Jesus. That fruit that the Spirit works in us as he shapes us more and more into the likeness of Jesus. You know, fruit like, I don't know, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, self-control. The fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22. Lives that look and taste more and more like Jesus and reflect his light to the world. And we'll only do that, we'll only live the fruitful life, as we said last week, if verses 3 to 6 we're living the dependent life. It's only as we suck up the nourishment, the life of Jesus, that we taste of and reflect him. You know, you want to marinate something in a sauce. You don't just dip it in, do you? You know, like I do when I make tea, because I don't really like tea, so I just like tea bag. It takes too long. And so Mark has to tell me every time, can you make it strong, please? Tea's pointless. But anyway, that's a different subject. But when you marinate food or you make tea, you've got to leave it in there, right? It's got to soak in. It's got to get the flavours in. You know, you want to marinate your chicken in something, you've got to leave it in there for ages so that the flavours soak in. We want to live the fruitful life. We've got to be marinated in Jesus so that our lives taste of him. That, Jesus says, is why we exist. Not all the arguments about can salt be, can actual salt lose its saltiness and stuff, and people going too far in the metaphor. All he's saying here, I think, is if you don't taste salty, you're probably not a Christian. If you don't taste the Jesus, you're probably not a Christian. If you say you're a Christian and you don't taste salty to the world around you, you don't taste like Jesus to the world around you, what's the point? You're useless. You're not living what you're designed to do. But when we do live and taste like Jesus, we bring the taste of light of Jesus to the world around us. We show the world what Jesus is like, what real life is like. And by God's grace, if we're doing it right, we give them a taste for it. Verses 10 to 12 tell us, don't they, that people might not like the taste of Jesus in our life, or our reflection of Jesus at first, or at all. But maybe for some of them, it's like when as a teenager you had your first sip of beer. Some of us never liked it again. There's a video of Jude having his first sip of beer on my Facebook. Go and watch it. See his face. Often as people taste our lives, they go, I don't like that. But over time, as we live alongside them, as we get into their lives, as we shine the gospel into their lives again and again and again, people start to taste and see that the Lord is good. We say, come taste and see no life in Jesus. And if that's you this morning, if you're not knowing Jesus, this is not you. You can't live this life. You're dead in your transgressions and sins. You've turned away from a holy God as a sinful person and face hell. God sent Jesus to live the perfect life, to die the death we deserve, that if we trust in him, we might have life everlasting. And do you notice how Jesus is speaking to his whole disciples? Again, as we see so much in the New Testament, all the yous here are plural. This is not an individual thing primarily. This is something we do together to be light and salt. So let's ask some questions, some really practical questions, which we'll go further in life group tonight. As Spen Valley Church, is this our prayer for one another and for us together? That we might be salty and be seen and give the world a taste of Jesus. That the Lord might use our lives to save his people. What about how we are together? Does our corporate life together taste of Jesus? Do we, in our interactions with one another, taste of Jesus and so encourage one another? Do we, in our speech and our lives, shine the light of Jesus onto each other's hearts to show up sin and encourage repentance and run into Jesus? Because if we don't taste like Jesus, if we don't reflect Jesus to one another, then we'll never do it outside in the world. What about our speech? Colossians 4:6 says, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders, and let your speech be seasoned with salt. Kevin says a lot. Someone told him once, we should leave the taste of salt in somebody's mouth as we speak the gospel to them, because it makes them thirsty for more. You get a bit of salt on your tongue, you get thirsty, right? Is that how our speech works with us around us? We leaving that taste of salt, that taste of Jesus in their mouth? Maybe as we ask ourselves these questions, we don't really like the answers. And if that's the case, run to the cross. There is forgiveness in the Lord Jesus. Ask him for grace to change, enabled us by his Spirit. But if all that's the case, if living as salt and light means we need to bring the taste of Jesus into people's lives, Jesus says, don't leave your salt in the cupboard. Don't turn your light off, because the second thing he says to us in these verses is be seen. Because if we want people to taste and see, if we want to be salt and we want to be light, then we need to be seen. It's what Jesus says in verse 14 and 15. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Remember where Jesus is stood, verse 1. He stood up on a mountainside. He's saying, look, we shine a light here. We put a big town up here, guys. Look around. Look how far we can see. You know, maybe you've been stood up on a mountain and you've looked around and you can see for miles. Or maybe think of Emily Moor Mast or Castle Hill or something like that. Wherever you go around here, you can see it. Jesus says we've got to be seen. We've got to be seen by everybody. And Jesus is aware of the temptation we have to run away from having our lives seen by everyone. To run away from the conflict that brings, right? He said that in verses 10 to 12, hasn't he? He knows we're going to be persecuted. He knows people are going to say all kind of things against us. Insult us. Because darkness hates light, right? Even if we've not seen Star Wars, we get it, right? Darkness and light fight against each other. But Star Wars has also spoiled it for us. Because light and dark are not equal forces that have to be in balance or fight against each other, are they? Instead, when you turn the light on, darkness flees. That's the picture of the lamp. Jesus says here, you've got a lamp. You don't put it under a bowl. You put it up high so that it shines everywhere in the house. Remember, they're probably in a one-room house, so you put one light in and it shines out to the whole house. Jesus is saying with our Christian lives, it's not like, you know, those pretentious things you can buy even from Home Bargains, you know, where you've got little fairy lights in a dark, smoky bottle. So they give out an ambience light. So it gives you a little bit of light, just enough so you can see what you're doing, but, you know, you're not going to be embarrassed. Light shining a clear light to give light to everybody in the house. Jesus is saying, when it comes to living out this salty, this reflecting life, this dependent, fruitful life, he's saying, don't be like your mum. Whack that big light on. Jesus is saying, our lives, blooming should look like Blackpool Illuminations. And he explains what that looks like. Verse 16, look. In the same way, let your light shine. He's doing a Forrest Gump, right? He's defining his picture. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. He's saying, let people see your life. Let people see that you are living this blessed, dependent, fruitful life so other people can see it. So they can see the fruit that dependence brings. So they can see not how awesome you are, and we're going to look at this with Mark in chapter 6 in a few weeks. You know, don't do your good deeds so that they can look at you and go, what an awesome person. Do it so that they can see the glory of God. They can see the power of God's grace in Jesus by the Spirit working in your heart and changing you. You know, it's like now we're getting more and more electric cars. On all the car shows, they're having the electric hypercars versus old school hypercars. And you know, you think of those fastest cars that you've seen, right? There's big petrol cars with massive engines and they're just getting absolutely battered by this tiny little Tesla. And it's flying away, just puts his foot down, it flies away. Nobody goes, oh, that driver in the electric car must be so much better than the old school guy. They go, wow, that technology's awesome, right? No. And that's what our lives are meant to be. Lives lived out in the sight of others, always pointing to Jesus so that they can see what he is doing in our lives. Jesus is saying, verses 14 to 16, into our context here, in Clecky and the Spen Valley, It's not enough. It's not good enough to just proclaim the light of the gospel and live godly lives on a Sunday in these walls here and to one another in our homes. It's not enough. It's like the old catchphrase thing. It's good, but it's not the one. It's not enough for people to see us drive in and drive out again and that be a witness to the world. It's not a bad thing, but it's not enough. They don't see the reality. They can't taste from a distance. Jesus is saying we need to be involved in each other's and those around us in their lives so that people taste and see that the Lord is good as they hear and see us. Notice what Jesus isn't saying here. Jesus isn't saying, verse 16, preach the gospel so that people might glorify your Father in heaven. It's not less than that. Preach the gospel, you don't use words if necessary. Whoever said that needs their head seeing. Bake a cake, use eggs if necessary. Oh, you can make a cake. You bake a cake, use flour if necessary. Right? I was going to say make a burger, put meat in it, but let's not even go there. You can't do this, you can't shine this light, you can't be salt in our community unless you preach the gospel, unless you speak the words of the gospel. It's not less than that. But he is saying more. As we preach that gospel to those around us, we need to give people the taste of Jesus. We need to shine the light. We need to authenticate the gospel through our lives together. You and I, we together can be as salty and as illuminated as we like, but unless that life is rubbed into the community, shining in every corner of it, people aren't going to taste and see it. Don't leave your salt in the cupboard. Get it on the meat. And again, it's corporate, isn't it? Verses 13 to 16, it is plural, the Lord is saying this. He's echoing again in verse 16, the Lord, what he says in John's Gospel, in chapter 13, verses 34 to 35, in chapter 17, verses 20 to 23. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples. You love one another as I have loved you. Jesus says in John 17 that it's our unity and our love for one another that shows people the gospel. It's as we shine into our town and our valley together in how we love one another and how we bring others into that, welcome others into that people start to taste and see that the Lord is good. That people so different love and serve one another. So here's some more questions for us as a church. In what ways are your interactions with people going to be different after lockdown to before? In how you taste of Jesus and how you are seen to be living for him. What steps are you taking now to make sure you're tasty and shining when you actually can spend more time with people going forward? How are we working, secondly, to ensure that we shine together? We're a town on a hill that cannot be hidden. We're a light that gives light to the whole room, the whole town, the whole valley. How are we working to ensure that we shine that light, that we taste that together? Jesus says it's as we love and interact with one another, it's as we taste and see in our lives together that people know we're his disciples. So how are you working? How are we working to make sure that people are interacting with us together? It's not just something the leadership do. But how are you thinking and praying about ways you might be able to introduce people that you know into opportunities to taste and see gospel community in action? Maybe it's a good time this for some of us to start looking at the roadmap now. You know, what are you going to be able to do on April 12th? What might you be able to start thinking about what you can do to be seen and be tasty from then? What about May the 17th? What about June the 21st? Or August or September or whenever we get there? Think now. That we together might be tasty, might be seen, because what Jesus is calling us to here is not complicated. It's simply living out this dependent, fruitful life for Jesus' glory together in our love and service of one another. It's living in such a way that people see this blessed, dependent, fruitful life in every area of our life and know why we're living it. Speaking in such a way that they know it's because of who we are in Jesus, knowing full well, as Jesus says in verses 10 to 12, that that's going to cost us. It's going to cause us difficulties. It's going to take us out of our comfort zones. Our favourite thing, right? He said to me, that's not easy. I never said it were easy. I said it's not complicated. But it is worth it, because Jesus says when we live like this, verse 16, the Father gets the glory. Jesus is seen as we reflect his light. He is the light of the world. As we reflect that light, he is seen, verse 14. The Lord calls him people to himself, and we get to live this blessed, dependent, fruitful life together. Life as it's meant to be. The good life of love in Jesus. I reckon that's a good deal. I reckon living salty and being seen is a good way to bring glory to Jesus. How will we do that? How will we work together and pray together that people might say, that Spen Valley Church, they're a bit tasty. Not like that. Maybe. But how will they say, I want me some of that? Because they're clearly living the life as it's meant to be in Jesus. Let's make it our prayer. Let's make it our aim. That by God's grace, people in Cleckheaton might see that and come to know the Lord Jesus as himself. Let's pray.